everybody, look down below. See the button? Hit subscribe. I love it. Thank you so much for all your support. Hi, everyone. I am Shannon, and welcome to Shannon Confidential. Shannon Confidential is a podcast about life, love, and everything in between. And today's in between is the first time I've ever covered this topic, and it has to do with climate change. It's the rise in sea level. And I have to tell you, John Englander, when I spoke to him to introduce myself to him and get to know each other and talk about the podcast, I was so excited. First of all, if you know me, I'm a total science geek, and this goes right up my science geekiness alley. And he is so good at what he does. He's an oceanographer. He's an expert in climate change, sea level rising. He's a professional speaker. He's an author of multiple books. He is truly incredible. And I have to tell you, this book that you see right behind me, the best read I've ever had when it comes to just climate change and sea level rise. He is so good at explaining it at the most simplest of levels. Everybody can understand it. He takes the science and just simplifies it for everybody. There's even science experiments in this book. I got to tell you, it's pretty spectacular. And once you get the book, you get a whole PDF of all the notes, all the graphics. I've never had a book that provided so much after information and extra little notes that you could read at any time to just to dive a little deeper into everything he's saying. Like I said, this book is so fascinating, so easily understandable. He writes it just like he's having a conversation with you, explains it all. I also had to learn that there were some misconceptions I had. So he is going to bring so much information to us today, and it's some serious stuff. And we're gonna, dive into it. It's really important that we all listen to it, because some of us may not be around when this actually happens, but we will have family that is, and we do have to leave this world a better place than when we arrived, is how I believe. And John Englander is going to just dive into this with me, and I cannot wait for you to hear from him. So here he comes up next, John Englander. Welcome, John Englander. Guys, ladies, gentlemen, everybody out there, this is the man I have been talking about. I have not stopped talking about this book since I read it. I have not stopped talking about you, John, since we met on the intro call. I find what you say and the way you say it so fascinating. And I want you to now introduce yourself to everybody, what you do, how you got to this point at your book, and then we'll dive into some really good questions.
Great, Shannon. I'm excited, and thank you for the opportunity. So I started looking at sea level back in college, and I hate to say that was 50 years ago. I studied geology, and the idea that during the ice ages, when the ice sheets moved up, got bigger or smaller, when the ice age, when they got bigger, that sea level dropped hundreds of feet, blew me away. And fortunately, at that time, I was working as a dive guide in the Bahamas during my summer breaks from college, and I was in the clear blue water, and 200 feet underwater found what I later realized was where the beach was 11,000 years ago, actually 15,000 years ago.
So how do you realize that that's the beach when you're at the beach?
It looks just like a miniature beach with sand and all at the same level and little shells and stuff that normally you would find on a beach, but now sea level is 200 feet higher. And that tied in perfectly. So in 1970, I had this real reality check and just powerful, indoctrination to the sea level in like 10 or 15,000 years, which is not that long ago, no. Moves up and down hundreds of feet. And that just blew my mind.
And that's normal. That's a normal.
That's normal,
yes.
Right. And we're unaware of it. And that was always in the back of my mind, but it doesn't change for thousands of years, so who cares? It was just kind of an academic interest. But over the coming decades, I got to do some really neat stuff diving. Thousands of dives. I was down in submersibles and went very deep on some occasions. I kept making note of evidence of old sea levels, still not thinking anything was going to change. And then in 97, I had a real privilege that Jacques Cousteau, who you may or may not remember, but was
I do.
Okay. We're of the same generation, I guess, that, we all watched his TV shows. And I did an event with him in Orlando, actually, and he hired me to become CEO. And we spent a few days together, and a few months later, he was dead, unfortunately. But that was a turning point for me. I looked at the world and the oceans differently because of some very in-depth discussions he and I had. It was a very privileged moment.
He was amazing.
Yes, yes. And then 10 years later, 2007, I took my first trip to Greenland. And it was there that I got the idea to write my first book, because I realized a fairly simple truth, that the oceans and planet are measurably warmer already. This is 2007. There's going to be less on the ice on the planet again, just like coming out of an ice age.
Yep.
20,000 years ago. If there's less ice on the planet, the sea will be higher. And if the sea is higher permanently, the shoreline is going to move inland. And that simple, 4 points, warmer planet, less ice, higher sea level, shorelines moving inland. I thought it was a profound concept. And I said that I would try and write a book about it to make it easy. And that's really my history to where we are today. And this is my second book now, Moving to Higher Ground.
I'm telling you, the way you wrote it, the way you took science and simplified it, even if someone didn't understand sea level, and there's a difference between glaciers, ice sheets, they're not all the same.
Nope.
And we'll get into that after. And floating ice doesn't change sea level when it melts, but ice that's attached to land that breaks off, that's different, correct?
Absolutely, you got it right, and
okay,
most people don't.
And this is, and you explain the science of this, where most people have no idea there is a difference. And land and sea and ice, they all heat at different levels, and that makes such a difference in what's going on with the melting ice.
No, you, Shannon, I'm really impressed. You read the book, you got it. Most people think that melting icebergs cause sea level rise. They don't now. And it's surprising, but I explain it very simply and visually. And as you said, my aim and apparently great success with the book is that even if somebody doesn't like science and gets turned off by that kind of stuff, it's the stories and the way I present things that everybody finds interesting.
It's just so easily understandable. Like a lot of what is talked in the science and with climate change and warming and all of this stuff, people get lost in the la 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 la. And it's really simpler than that. I mean, even in your book where you take a cup of ice, put it in an ice cube, measure the water, it doesn't rise. That's basically an iceberg.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than that.
No,
so when
it doesn't.
they cover the stuff and they go crazy on the news, oh, there's massive, look at all, they're actually completely wrong.
Yes.
They're trying to glorify knowledge that they don't even have.
And then it goes beyond that, because then people take something like sea level rise, which is quite powerful, that the sea is going to be 5 or 10 feet higher one day, and then some. And they confuse it with good efforts to switch to renewable energy or save the Everglades or take care of sea turtles or whatever, dolphins. I mean, all of our things.
It's just not the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we have to stay focused on the different things. And with sea level rise, it's tempting to change the subject, because the truth is we don't really want to think about the implications. So I think people with good intentions and lots of concern for the oceans, which I certainly have. I mean, I have thousands of dives, and that was my life for 35 years. But the issue of sea level rise is different. It's not an ocean issue, it's a land issue, because cities all over the world are going to go underwater. It's just started.
It's all coastlines, and it's even more than that. It's not just coastlines, it's all low-lying areas. And it's not just the United States, it's the world. So think about this. We are all at some point surrounded by coastlines. So imagine all of that coming in and then be like, okay, so I lost my beachfront property. Oh, no. It's bigger than that, because the low-lying areas in all these different countries, they're going to be underwater as well. It's the rise of sea level. It affects more than just your beachfront property.
I love you. You're great. You've got it. It's 140 nations that border the ocean one way or another. and they're all going to have their coastlines changed by sea level rise. And it goes, as you say, far inland. It goes up tidal rivers. So whether it goes up the Hudson River in New York or it goes up the Mississippi River or the Nile, this reaches far inland through swamplands like the Everglades. But beyond that, there's going to be some surprises for people.
Yeah, and we're talking, what, 30 years?
Well, I like to say it's hard to know for sure for a few reasons. We don't know how warm the planet will be because we don't know how we're going to make our electricity and what we're going to do with coal and those things, and the kind of questions being discussed in the next few weeks at the climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland. But at the simplest level, we know a fair amount of heat's already in the oceans. And even if we stopped future warming, just the heat that's in the oceans, the extra degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that's going to cause more ice to melt on Greenland and Antarctica. So we like to say that's locked. Pardon?
That's where it's starting from, is the ice.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Way down.
The ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica are 2 miles high. In fact, you can see it above me there. There's Greenland, and of course, Antarctica is behind me. Those are the two ice masses. They hold 98% of potential sea level rise, over 200 feet if they were to all melt. Now, that's not going to happen for centuries or maybe a few thousand years. But in this century, we need to take seriously that sea level is going to be several feet higher. We don't know whether it be 5 or 10. It depends on how warm we let the planet get and exactly how 2 miles of ice melts down. And that you can't model that accurately any more than you can accurately model the pandemic, which we've all learned about. We didn't know a year ago whether we're going to lose 2, 3, 4, or 5 million people to the COVID-19. We now know it's 5 million as of today. Okay. Who would have thought that? The models give us some ideas, but the models don't predict the future. They give us scenarios. And with sea level rise, it's the same thing. There are some models that say we're only going to have 4 feet of sea level rise this century. Some say 10. Okay. We'll see what happens. Because
it's like watching when the hurricanes come in, the spaghetti.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
They're just models, people.
That's right.
But you have to pay attention to it because it is real and it is unstoppable, correct?
Yes. There's even if we stopped all fossil fuel burning today, I mean, no more coal, no more oil, no more natural gas. If we could switch to instantly solar 100% and wind, and nuclear and so on, even if we could do that, we'd have sea level rise for centuries because we've stored a tremendous amount of excess heat in the ocean. 90% or so is stored in the ocean. And that warmer ocean is like, it's like a hot, swimming pool, if you will, or a bathtub. It takes a while to cool down. And in the process, though, as it's cooling down, the ice on Antarctica and Greenland is melting faster and faster. So that's why we know that even in the rosiest scenarios, that sea level is going to be many feet higher. And we need to change our mindset about the coastline.
And inland low-lying areas. Now, I hear people, okay, it's climate change, it's global warming, okay. And again, I kind of say a little flip, only because to me, it's just like, you got to think bigger. When people go, well, I'm going to get an electric car, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. I'm not saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, John, I'm not saying those aren't good decisions to make, but it would have to be done on such a ginormous global scale to even make a dent. Is it?
I would take
the fossil fuels and the carbon and all of that. Really, that's the radical change that needs to happen.
Yes. So the way I would you're right. I would rephrase that a little bit. We need to get very aggressive about slowing the warming. Okay, and that's electric cars and getting off fossil fuels and solar panels and all of those important things and energy efficient buildings. We really need to do that, or it's going to get a lot worse a lot quicker. So that's really job one. 2 is to realize that even if we do that, the unusual storm patterns, more high heat days in different parts of the world, more drought, more heavy rainfall, which seems counterproductive, or contradictory, that you shouldn't have more drought and more rainfall at the same time, but that's what happens on a warmer planet. So we've got to get used to extreme weather, okay, which can happen now, next week, next year, and prepare for that, because this weird weather and extreme high tides even, that's going to be with us for a long time. And the third thing we have to do is start looking ahead to sea level, because it can't get too high too quickly. As you quoted, I say in about mid-century, 30 years from now, we could have a foot or two, but the problem is in the second half of the century, it will accelerate, and we could have 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet late in the latter part of the century and more in the next century.
And a foot
So
or
it's a
two
real
is
mind
significant.
change.
It's significant. A foot or two is significant. A foot or two in some low-lying areas can cause a catastrophic flood. So
Yes.
a foot or two, don't just be like, oh, no big deal.
No, it's
a big deal.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Because what that affects and how that travels down to the lower lying areas changes everything. And God, I have so many questions. So I'm just going to go to some of my notes. You talk a lot about intelligent adaptation, and that is just engaging and educating society. Now, we know there's higher level people that make decisions, okay? No matter how much you read books or research, you got to get the people to make the decisions to start understanding, plan ahead, people. And this is where I have a hard time with people who have agenda and don't feel the need to, pick up the pace a little bit, because they're probably not going to be here when this happens. So let me just use my position to my benefit. And I'm going to call it corruption or what have you. And then it's left to the next guy, the left guy. And there's a point where it's left too long, because there's infrastructure that has to be done to prepare for what's coming when, say, our kids are adults or our grandbabies are adults, because that's about the time frame. And you have to think of lifting roads, lifting homes, like getting prepared for what's coming, not to mention how it's going to affect everything that's already low, and lease agreements, land agreements, legal documents, because these people who have these contracts on these different places may not just be there. Am I wrong on any of this?
No, you are spot on. And I mean, you really have absorbed it all. And the only thing I would go back and perhaps redirect a little bit is to think that, the decision makers, we talk about the people in important places, however you phrase that, but they're misinformed often, because the misunderstanding about this starts with icebergs causing sea level rise, which it doesn't, as you know, and the fact that this is unstoppable now, and that this is different than recycling and saving the Everglades and lots of other important causes.
Erosion.
No, it's different than coastal erosion, although they interface a little bit. But so, what I suggest people do with my book, besides reading and recommending it as you're doing, but is to talk about the content, because it is revolutionary and it's gotten very well reviewed, as you know. In fact, it's been fantastic. And it really pushes back against a lot of misunderstanding, where people say, well, to deal with climate change, we should do more recycling. No, we should recycle and we should deal with climate change. They're different things, And
I think people don't realize they butt heads on that, but they need to come together.
We've heard in Florida, where you and I both live, that politicians say things like, well, we need to get ready for sea level rise, so we need more renewable energy. Well, that's not quite true, okay? And it's ignorant. It's widespread and commonly held. And so I believe the leaders will respond when the public gets a problem, and if you think about it, no great transformation happens until the people get it, because the leaders aren't going to get too far ahead of the voters. Okay.
Yeah, and the problem is a lot of money, and people don't get elected when they have these plans to spend a ton of money on something people haven't even allowed themselves to realize is real. So it doesn't make sense to them, and they want to spend the money, and that's not going to go well in voting.
Right. So the first thing is to level the playing field and explain things in very plain language, and looking ahead far enough, 30 years or so, which is a generation, but it's a mortgage. It's the length of a mortgage for most homeowners and things like that. So 30 years, to me, is the sweet spot. Sea level rise is not going to rise much in the next year, maybe a half inch. Okay. But it's the acceleration that's the problem. And if it gets to a foot or two by mid-century, and if it can get to 6 to 10 feet or 12 feet by end of century, that makes sense to people. But the sweet spot is 30 years, because a foot or two in 30 years, as you said, is a big deal. Streets go underwater, sewers overflow, fresh water supplies don't work.
And if you've ever watched the news where those catastrophic floods are taking out homes and just washing people away, that's what we're talking about here. And that's 30 years from it happening. So planning and preparing is actually well before that, because you can't start lifting everybody up when it's already flooded.
You've got it. And you think about it, that not only the normal building, even a house today often lasts 100 years, but certainly 50 years. But as you say, infrastructure, roads, utility plants, fresh water plants, wastewater treatment plants, bridges, tunnels, those things are all designed for a certain water height. They all are designed for 100 years lifespan. Okay, that's normal in infrastructure. And most of it lasts for 200 years. Now, we've got to think different.
Yeah, we got to think up.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we have to go up, because that's just going to happen. But we also have to think so much more responsibly. And I am not in government. Don't know if you realize that. But why is it so difficult if the radical steps are the fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide and the changes that can be made, and we have the ability to make these changes? Why is there such a fight? Why, if this is what it would take to slow it down, because you're not going to stop it, but to at least slow it down, why wouldn't everybody be like, yeah, let's do it? What is the problem? Is it just lack of knowledge, or is there money to be made in one end and people just can't give up the greed to do the right thing?
It's both. It's both misunderstanding, people thinking that that we can stop climate change quickly, or we can stop sea level rising quickly, and that's not quite true, or that it's the same as saving the Everglades or recycling, or not getting plastic straws out of the ocean, or plastic bags, which are all important causes.
They're all important. People don't write in. He's not.
But you have to associate the right treatment with the right problem. Yeah. I like to say with medical things, if you've got a problem, you've got to have the right treatment for. You don't go to the doctor and say, I'm sick. You say, I have a problem, my heart, my lungs, or skin, or whatever.
You're trying to cut your toenails. Wouldn't make any sense.
Right. And you've got to have the right treatment for the right symptom or the right illness. And with sea level, that's different than a lot of these other issues. So we've got to slow the warming. We've got to be prepared for strange weather, extreme weather, droughts, floods, wildfires. And then we've got to begin adapting now for sea level rise, which won't show up till mid-century, to an extreme degree, but by then it's too late, as you say. So now's the time to begin planning. You got it exactly right, because the bridge, the tunnel, the foundation, the road that we plan and approve tomorrow we have to assume is here 50 to 100 years from now.
And I know they have they're working in New York to try to, help with their flooding issue. Where are they getting it right or wrong?
Yes and no. So New York, because of Hurricane Sandy, which was now 2012, 9 years ago, they've done a good job of planning for flooding up to about 4 feet. But beyond about 4 feet, just like Miami, they're going to have some real problems. But they are doing some smart planning for 4 feet. So that's at least buy us some time. It's not a permanent solution as they're doing it. As far as the Netherlands, or as often called Holland, but it turns out, and I learned this when I went over there on a few trips of research, Holland are only there's 2 states in the Netherlands, Holland and South Holland. Holland does not apply to the whole country, strangely, and I made that mistake. So the Netherlands, which is the entire country, they have done some aggressive engineering to try and prevent flooding. It all was developed after a one-night storm in February 1953, when 1,835 people died. That same storm killed a bunch of people in London and also in Belgium. But they engineered this brilliant coastal protection scheme, but they didn't allow for enough sea level rise. So even the Dutch have found that the plans that they've been proud of for 50 years need to be rethought, because when sea level rise is several feet or a meter, as they would say it, higher, they need to redesign and re-engineer and rethink what they can defend. So the Dutch are among the leaders, but even they are challenged by the increasing rate of sea level rise.
Yeah, because they use they did the whole dry polder thing.
Yes, right. The polders are where they have a seawall, and it's got enough clay in it that it can keep out the water, not like Miami's porous rock.
Yeah.
And so they then, starting with windmills 1,000 years ago, and now with big electric pumps, they pump out the water, and you have this below sea level thing called a polder, which is a land that can then be developed as long as the seawall holds, and the pumps, keep the water out.
And just looking forward to the effects of this. First of all, any state, country, what have you, that plans ahead and gets ahead of this, it's like, build it and they will come, or you have to spend money to make money. The value of the land that they will have prepared in advance would be unbelievable. If they just had the wherewithal to plan in advance and allow that, they would be the place to go.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And in fact, I make that point in the book that while it may be, we may not want to do this adaptation, and back to your earlier question, it's expensive, it's disruptive. There are people who, stand to lose if we abandon coal and fossil fuels. There's lots of reasons why people don't want to make this shift. But I turn it around and I talk about the glass half full, that there's a positive opportunity here. Because sea level rise, once you think about it or get to learn a little bit, it's inarguable. I mean, sea level has been 25 feet higher in geologic history. It was 122,000 years ago. But we know that happened even without human influence. So the idea that sea levels that we think of as a permanent level is going higher, which it is, and there's no doubt because of the heat that's in the ocean, that we really have a magic opportunity. As difficult as it will be to think that whether it's Miami or Bangladesh or Vietnam or London or Shanghai or Thailand or Bahamas or any other place, 140 nations, we have time to adapt. Now, it's going to be some tough decisions. It's not all pretty. I mean, some places are going to disappear, but we have maybe 100 years to prepare for it. Okay, that's a blessing. It's not like a tsunami that's going to come through overnight and kill 200,000 people. It's gradual. We actually have generations, but we got to start now, as you say. And
and then trying to get someone to come up with a plan, get the bill ready, get the laws passed. That takes, as we know, a tremendous amount of time to weed through it all and actually get it done. And that's before you even start.
Yeah, but here, I don't think I actually point this out in the book, but besides all of that being true, one of the things I talk about is that people are already making the decision to leave. There are people who want to get ahead of the curve and not wait for market values to drop on their homes or their, office buildings or whatever they own. And so because of what I do and because of, being recognized an expert in this, I'm aware of many people who have already moved to higher ground. It's not in the future for them. I cite some cases in the book where a former newspaper publisher here in South Florida is now living in Asheville, North Carolina, 2,000 feet above sea level. So people will respond differently looking at the future. Some will wait for the problem to be at their doorstep. Some will wait for the government to pay them and so on. But one of my premises that is somewhat unusual in my field is to say, you don't just have to wait for the government, because the truth is everybody that owns property, whether it be a house or an apartment building or a business in low-lying coastal areas, and as you say, not just on the coast, but on lowland that's accessible to the sea as the sea rises, we're going to have a migration. It's not going to happen one day. It's not going to happen when the water arrives. As the water gets higher, people are going to get the message and start moving to higher ground. It's going to happen over a century. It's already started, amazingly.
It's started.
What thinking that we're going to protect every low-lying area is nonsense. I mean, if we had known 500 years ago that sea level would be 20 feet higher, we would have designed differently, but we didn't know it then.
Now we have the technology to have this knowledge, and what are we going to do with it?
Right.
I mean, I live in downtown Fort Lauderdale, and I'm not going to get into all the craziness with how old our pipe systems are and how often they break. Lord knows you can see that all over the news. But what is amazing to me is we, hired this very capable person to come in and make changes to the water sewer. And he realized the lackadaisical, it just wasn't being, the whole city is not being run properly. They've got the money to make the changes, but they're not allowing all of that money to go to the changes. So the change is only going to get more and more expensive, but they would love to put in an underground travel source to get us to the beach. Is that even going to work in 30 years? And that's where they want to put the money? Come on.
Right. No, great question.
That's what I don't get the logic. If you're not paying attention to what's going on in your city and the effect the people of the city in less than 30 years, because you have to start planning for it, what are you thinking?
Well, one of the criticisms that's often hurled at elected officials is they think about their term in office. And I'm not putting this on any one individual, but it's tempting if you think you've been hired for 4 years or 5 years or 6 years, for a political position, you want to make things good in your term in office typically. But I would turn that around and say, if those people have kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews, or just concerned about their legacy, thinking 50 or 100 years ahead is the smartest thing you can do, because you can look like a genius. Okay, you don't have to do
books about you. You'll have statues.
Yeah, you don't have to do it all this year. What you need to do is think of this as intelligent adaptation, to say, if I know something's going to change over a century, let me put into place some planning to say, if you're building something for 30 years, do this. If you're building it for 50 or 60 years, do that. Yeah. If it's going to last 100 years, it should be even higher. I mean, that's intelligent adaptation.
And yes, I'm not a politician, and I don't want to throw it all on them, but at the end of the day, that's where the decisions have to be made to do this. I can't just put my home, on stilts. There has to be approvals, and there's associations and all this stuff that has to happen, which, just like it was said in your book, and it just makes every little bit of sense, all of that new intelligent adaptation are opportunities with jobs.
Yes.
Think about renegotiating legal agreements, renegotiate land agreements, all different new types of agreements for the people that are building infrastructure. There's a whole world of legal that has to be developed to compensate for everything that went underwater, to everything that has to get built, not to mention the jobs and the positions for the people to actually build these infrastructure changes. There is so much opportunity out there that this has a plus side.
No, in fact, you may recall that I say that the sea level rise this century will be the economic engine of this century, because it's not optional. I mean, if the sea is 5 feet higher, it's not like you say, am I going to pay attention to that or not? I mean, it's ridiculous. We've never faced this. And once you think it through, this is unavoidable. So while I say hypothetically, and just as a rounded figure to say, let's say we're going to lose $10 trillion of assets to 10 feet of sea level rise globally, which is, I mean, it's not the right number, but it's order of magnitude close enough. That's terrible. We're going to lose $10 trillion of assets, land, buildings, properties, infrastructure. We're going to create that same value, because very few people are going to die from sea level rise. They're going to be displaced. And particularly in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, where there's tens, if not 100 million people just in those two countries that are living at the edge of sea level. But we have to create houses and new communities and roads and water treatment plants and so on. We have no choice. And with sea level rise, it's gradual enough. It's not like a hurricane or a tsunami or a tornado that creates devastation overnight. Sea level rise is gradual. It's like the drip filling the bucket.
And that's where I think that's a beautiful analogy. You take a bucket and you put a couple of, you just let it drip. You just let it drip. Yep. But that's also the attention span of people. How long are they going to sit there and watch that bucket fill? Eventually they're going to be like, yeah, this is like watching paint dry. I'm out of here, out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
But that bucket is still filling.
That's right. So when you think of it with that perspective, and you realize this is terrible, this is tragic, I'm going to lose grandma's home in the Bahamas or whatever, that the truth is, wait a minute, this is a terrible problem, but the fact that it's going to unfold over decades or centuries and it's unavoidable is a blessing, because the truth is you don't have to do anything today, Shannon. I mean, there's nothing between today and tomorrow that you have to do about sea level rise. But if you and your husband are planning to stay there for 50 years, 30 years, then you might say, well, maybe in the next 10 years, we should, go to a higher floor in our condo, or we should move to higher ground, or we should buy a houseboat, or whatever you wish to do. But the truth is you have time to decide. Okay?
Well, and to what you were just saying, we did want to get to possibly relocate. And when we were deciding on where to go, let there be absolutely no doubt, John, that we were talking about your book. And we are now currently looking at places in Tennessee, we're looking at elevation, because, and I'm not saying, okay, yeah, in Tennessee to have a house that has some elevation would be beautiful views. And yeah, that's one of the reasons why people go there. But I've never thought about where to buy a home based on sea level rise. Never even in my wildest dreams would I have said that is a deciding factor until I read your book, because it's so clearly stated. Good
for you. Thank you. I'm honored. I'm honored. You're, as you know, in the book, I quote this, as I say, former publisher of a newspaper in Fort Lauderdale, Sun Sentinel, the big newspaper. And he talks about the Englander retreaters, that people who've read my book who are beginning to retreat at their own schedule and pace. And we don't know if there's dozens or hundreds or thousands yet, but the number's growing, and you'll be one of them.
Yeah, I'm telling you, everybody. And of course, everything John talks about, I will link you up to everything. And a lot of the different examples he gives, the book that once you purchase the book, you have access to a downloaded PDF of all, like I said earlier, all the notes to take a deeper dive, all the graphics. Some people can listen and learn, some people are more visual. He does take care of it both ways. I'm telling you, this man did a miraculous job of simplifying something that is going to, at some point, affect the entire world. And the other side I want to say to that is, if you're going into different countries and affecting some of these countries that have these low-lying areas, that's a massive security risk to our country. True?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the last year or so, we were talking about 1 million immigrants in the world, in the Mediterranean, crossing the Mediterranean from Africa to Europe, or coming up the US border, crossing Mexico, of course, big issue in the United States. Whatever the accurate number is, let's call it 1 million immigrants, okay? We're talking now 500 million people, for lack of a better round number, that this century will be displaced by rising sea level. That's not from me. The Economist magazine, one of the most respected, if not the most respected magazine in the world, put that figure out there, talking about the uncertainty of sea level rise. You don't know exactly the number, but if you look at the big picture, about 500 million of the world's 8 billion people are at risk from being displaced by rising sea level this century. That's a mind-boggling
all over the world, number. Everybody. That affects us here too.
Sure.
Because it's their governments and how they run, and their people moving and that's massive security issues that are going to ripple
absolutely
across the world.
Yeah, I used to live in Fort Lauderdale. Before that, I lived in the Bahamas for 25 years. So the vulnerability of a low-lying coastal island is very real to me. And people forget about the Bahamas. It's 400,000 people right off the coast where you are. We tend to think very locally, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Jacksonville, Naples, Tampa, which is fine and certainly relevant, but it's every coastal community. So as I remind people, it's Mobile, Alabama, and Houston, Texas, and Charleston, and Savannah, and Annapolis, and Baltimore.
We're surrounded by water. Our entire U.S., we're surrounded. It's all of us, because everybody going in and where you work and where you play, like everything's affected by this.
Yeah, the world's going to change,
yes.
And we deny it because it's inconvenient. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be disruptive. But the biggest problem is and I don't think I said this earlier, but we've never seen this before. You know, we believe threats when we've seen them. Whether it be getting our hand burned or cutting ourselves with a knife, we pay attention in the future. But if we've seen a problem, even a tsunami or a tornado or a hurricane or a heavy rainfall or a drought or a wildfire, we've seen those things. We know they can happen again. We've never seen sea level be higher. The last time sea level was higher was 120,000 years ago when it got 25 feet higher without human influence. The last time it was lower, as I said, was 20,000 years ago when it was 400 feet lower. So we were ignorant of that. We didn't really understand it in geology until the last century or so. So that's why we have real trouble with this, because for 6,000 years, pretty much all of human civilization, sea level's been sea level. And in fact, to the point where we measured something as being this high above sea level or this high below sea level.
It's actually a stat.
Right. We thought it was like a measurement line. Well, it turns out the line's moving. What kind of a measurement line is that? I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
And so you were talking about the history going back and how it's all changing now. First of all, we know that the Earth is on, if I'm not like a 23.5-degree tilt.
Great. Very good.
Okay. Now, so that's affecting, the melting, because, everybody looks at the Earth and it's just like this perfect little ball that sits straight up and down. It's not straight up and down. It's not what you see in movies, or some of the movies anyway. But also going back to history, is there any relation to how this is all taking place with the shift in the magnetic fields? Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to pretend to know that the exact term, I do understand that.
The magnetic poles reverse, but that's over longer periods of time, like 1,000 years.
Okay.
And although there's a natural movement of the magnetic pole,
because they're showing them that they have moved.
It has moved, but it's not why sea level's rising or climate's changing. Okay,
so it's different.
So there's truth in changing the poles moving. That's been happening for as long as we've had compasses, and we've noticed that and put them on maps. In fact, the idea that the poles are reversing, which is what some are alleging, and that's why climate's changing, is, I believe, nonsense. The poles have reversed in Earth's history, but a pole reversal takes like 1,000 or 1,500 years. Okay, that's not what's happening in the last 30 years. Okay, we know what's happening. We're putting more carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide and 30 gases that we call the greenhouse gases. They're clear. They're not like black carbon in the air. They're absolutely clear, but they trap heat. And that was demonstrated in 1859, okay, by Sir John Tyndall in London. And that greenhouse gas layer, just like a clear, roof of a greenhouse, lets light in, and the radiant energy gets converted into heat, and the heat's trapped there, just like in a greenhouse. And that's what's happening there. Has nothing to do with the poles reversing.
Okay.
Even if the poles are going to reverse in the next 1,500 years, that has no correlation to why the planet's warming.
And I wanted to ask that. Somebody had mentioned it to me, so I thought, let me throw the question out.
It's one of the things that's out there. The other one is that there's an 11-year solar cycle, and we're entering the cooling period. They've been saying that for 11 years, and that's not proving true. There is an 11-year solar cycle, that's true, but again, it doesn't correlate with the warming we're seeing. So people like to take things like the magnetic reversal of the poles, the 11-year solar cycles, and all these other things as a way to kind of confuse things, because they don't want to look at the issue of climate change and sea level rise squarely for what it is. And
some people just don't, until you actually look into what the sea level rise is and what is actually causing it. It's just a misconception. It just takes some education and getting society caught up, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you realize you don't know it.
You're great.
Is that
you got it? No, you got it. You've got it. By the way, not to distract. Did you see the interview I just did with William Shatner? I think.
Actually, I did.
Yeah. And yours is going to go right up there with his. But he made the same point. That we're ignorant. Of these most basic fundamentals about our planet, and we've got to talk them up and put them into plain language, which is what you're doing and what he did. And it's great.
Yeah, and one of the things, and thank you very much, by the way. And one of the things, going back to talking about the fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide and everything, you talk about a carbon capture and sequestration process.
Right.
And is that what you're referring to, like that greenhouse, like capturing it, sequestering it?
So if you look at the ice age cycles, which go back, in the recent one is 2.5 million years old. We've had ice ages every 100,000 years roughly, as you've seen in the book. And so the planet's temperature varies 9 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius with each cycle. It's about every 100,000 years. That's a natural pattern. What's happening now is we're changing the upper limits of the atmosphere, which traps more heat. That's a different phenomenon. The greenhouse gases are now at 400, or carbon dioxide is now at 415 parts per million. Okay, just let's call it 400 to make it simple. The normal natural range for the last 2.5 million years of the ice ages was roughly 180 to 280. We're now at 415. And we know that the Earth's temperature correlates with the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. It was caused by natural causes. Now we're causing it. And so we've gone into a different kind of era at the moment. But when we talked about carbon capture and sequestration, that's referring to that because temperature correlates with carbon dioxide levels as the greenhouse gas, we have to actually try to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either where it's produced at a coal-fired power plant, but also just out of the air. There's machines now to take carbon dioxide and then capture it and bury it underground or turn it into a kind of cement. And there are lots of good experiments with that. The problem is they're ridiculously expensive, and we have no idea yet how to scale it up sufficiently to do the job, because carbon dioxide is only 400 parts per million. That's like 0.04%. And it's very hard to get those diffuse molecules out of the atmosphere, but we're trying, because it's one of the ways we can maybe slow the warming, but it's still an unproven technology.
Well, it's nice to know they're working on it.
Yes.
So I had said this to you earlier, and I wanted to ask you on air, because I have to tell you, when I told you, I yelled your name out loud. I truly did. A good visual, and if it was real, is I was watching the movie Reminiscence. I believe that's called Reminiscence. And the opening scene, it's supposed to be taking place in Miami, and you just see an entire city, some completely underwater, some ankle deep, some and they're living their lives walking through puddles, and homeless people are in puddles, and the whole world has changed. And that's what I visualized when I was reading your book and talking with you. And I thought, I have to ask him, is that realistic?
Well, yes and no. I mean, sea level will be that high and more, and there will be streets awash. And there have been several other novels placed in New York as well as Miami and different places to kind of help people visualize this. There's some value in helping people, think this through, but I think as sea level rises and it becomes clear that it's accelerating, the drip is getting faster, that's filling the bucket, and people take this seriously, and that'll probably happen in 20 years or so, let's say, in the next few decades. As that happens, I think some of those coastal cities will be, I won't say abandoned, but they're either going to have to totally re-engineer themselves, or people are going to leave, because it's very expensive and very ineffective to try and live 2 feet underwater. I mean, if somebody said, well, let's build a city and put it 3 feet underwater, nobody'd move there, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. Why would you do that? So the Dutch did this thing to accommodate, because that's where they grew up, and they had this storm and the land was sinking, and they engineered more land by using the polders, as we said a few minutes ago. But I think in places like Miami and Fort Lauderdale, I mean, I could name 100 coastal cities. I could name 1,000 coastal communities, because it's not Miami just, or Fort Lauderdale. It's Boston and Bangladesh and Vancouver and San Diego and Marina del Rey, and San Francisco Bay and Sacramento, California, which is inland, and Hartford, Connecticut. Those are both untidal rivers, by the way, to your example. Good examples that Sacramento, California and Hartford are both almost 100 miles from the coast. They're on tidal rivers.
So
5 feet of sea level rise is going to flood both those communities, not places we think of. Okay.
mhm.
So as this new reality for the first time in human civilization, which is about 6,000 years of recorded human civilization, at some point, we're going to wake up and there will be a retreat, or we will have designed cities on floats, or we will put them on stilts like they are in the Keys today, the Florida Keys, where they've raised all the buildings to take care of hurricanes, basically.
Mhm.
So we're going to find some adaptation, whether it be floats, moving to higher ground, 200 feet above sea level so that it's safe, or stilts, Bill, or things like that.
Yeah.
We will adapt, because you'd be an idiot to,
Yeah.
year after year, decade after decade, see the water rising higher and higher,
And
not realizing that even you can walk to higher ground. I mean, we're not talking about moving to Colorado. We're talking about moving 10, 20, 30, 200 feet above sea level. I mean, that's not a huge distance. It's going to be a challenge, but we have decades to do it. What we've got to do is what you're doing, which is get educated and tell others. And that's why I'm delighted to be with you, because what you're doing, or what we're doing, is what needs to be done to break this down into plain English, get rid of these things about solar cycles and magnetic reversals and all this other stuff, blowing smoke or ignorance or disinformation, and just talk the truth to people and put it into language that's not technical, that makes as much sense as ice cubes melting.
I'm telling you, is that there was just so many light bulb moments. It was like a cartoon. If you could see all the light bulbs going off as I'm reading your book, I kid you not.
Great. That's great.
And I truly loved all the little notes and going through the PDF and doing the little deeper dive into the side notes. I maybe that's just the way your brain works, and that's fantastic, but it was so helpful.
Great. Did you like the cartoon? Did you like the cartoons?
Yeah, the cartoons were cute.
There was one editor from Israel, a science editor, who wrote me. She said, John, she said, your book is maybe the best nonfiction book she'd ever read, which was amazing. She said, except for maybe Silent Spring, famous book by Rachel Carson. But she said she's embarrassed to say it. She said, but even though the book was wonderful, she said the 3 cartoons
I love
were her favorite part of the book.
They were very cute. They were very cute. Yeah. I'll link them up in the.
Yeah, you can do that. Sure, feel free.
To see them. You actually used a lot of humor in this, for something so serious.
Well, it's purposeful, because as I've been doing this for about 10 years, I realized if you just depress people, nothing happens, frankly. Okay, they shut down. They'll change subject, they'll ignore it, frankly, if there's no. And when you're giving somebody difficult information, if you can just keep a sense of humor, I mean, it's not that it's funny, but there's a humorous side to everything.
Yeah. And there should be more of it.
And it really helps. I mean, as they say, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, or whatever. But even if we get go to our doctor and get a terrible diagnosis or something, keeping a sense of humor is really important to get through it for us and our loved ones. And so introducing the kind of the humorous comments and the 3 cartoons were very purposeful, because I'm giving people some information that may be challenging to process.
Yeah. And I said in the intro, when you read the book, it truly is, you feel like you're having a conversation with you. Like, I could hear your voice. It's not just, you're just, reading. It really is like, it's a conversation. It's an explanation. It's not just statistics and a bunch of great big words, so you try to sound smart. It really is. It's like you had a conversation with your book and you put it in writing, and then you went, here, read it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what it tried to be. So thank you for saying that. And, it starts out from the first paragraph, as you may remember. Page 1, I describe flooding in Seattle 100 years ago and what they did to solve it. It's a very real story. They, after the Great Seattle Fire a century ago, they'd already been having flooding because the land there was sinking. So I describe how, faced with rebuilding from the fire, the smart city officials and the business community said, well, let's build to get ahead of the rising water because the land is sinking. And they built the city 22 feet higher. that was visionary. I mean, it really took a lot of money and was really disruptive. They had to take ladders and climb up to street level for the first decade. But they saw a problem. They were smart enough to see where it was headed, and they took decisive action. And today, that part of Seattle, it's Pioneer Square, is thriving. In fact, and you can go on tours of the old underground world from 100 years ago. It exists. If you go to Seattle, I'd recommend doing it. I loved it. Here are hotel lobbies that are now a story underground because sea level was rising, the ground was sinking, and they raised the streets and they abandoned what were the old ground floors. And you can go into the old hotel lobbies that are now below street level. And there's bars and restaurants down there and coffee shops and stuff. So it's proof. This happened in just over a century ago.
I love it. The human mind is so incredible. We just got to let it do what it needs to do, and we'll all be okay, but we all have to be okay. We can't just be reactionary.
Right.
And a lot of the world and what happens is we react to something. Well, you have explained what is coming. So let's not react, let's plan, let's educate. And what I think, because this is going to happen, generations, that are much younger and not even born yet, we have to educate our kids.
Yeah.
Is this in schools at all?
Just starting, and most of it's misinformation, unfortunately, or it's confused with these similar but unrelated things like, recycling and renewable energy, which are great, and or animal concerns or coral reefs, which are all important. But a lot of the information is confused. It suggests that if we just switch to renewable energy like solar panels and pick up trash and recycle, that climate change will be fine. And that's just not true. So there's a lot of misinformation, but there's a lot of teachers who are getting it, who are getting educated and teaching it. And we're in a moment in history where, and you're part of it now, of really shifting our awareness, getting to different audiences. This is a revolutionary concept that most people would prefer not to know about. And it's going to take explaining it in language that's super simple, not the normal science jargon, and which is how we tend to, the engineers and scientists tend to explain things, and that turns people off. And if you give people too much factual data, they just shut down. I mean, most people are not engineers and can't process tables of data. And so I try and take a very different approach.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for writing the book, because it changed how many books changed your life? But I could tell you, yours did. And we're moving as part of what knowledge was learned from that book. And getting to meet you and knowing that you're the man behind the book, and you're so normal, and you're just honest, and you're trying to do the right thing, and you're trying to educate, and you're just trying to prepare for what is coming. And the fact that you took the time, because you just got back from London.
Yeah, Saturday.
Yeah, you're all over the place, and you just said you have another conference that you're heading off to. You're incredibly busy, man. And thank you for taking the time to dive into this with me and help get the word out, because I'm sure you're just going to have to hit the ground running to your next thing. I think you had until 3 o'clock or something. So I can't thank you enough. It's been an absolute incredible pleasure to meet you this way, to bring your word out. And if you write another book, you better tell me.
Shannon, I promise that. And more than that, I'm so impressed by your reading of the book and absorbing it, and your interview here. I've done a lot of interviews, but this is a really first-class interview, and I appreciate that. You've done a great job.
I have goosebumps. You just made me so happy. You're going to make the rest of my day and week and month like I'm going to
float. If you ever, as time goes on, even before I do another book, if you ever want to, carry this subject further and do part 2, I'm available.
All right, let's talk about that after. I'm in. I am in.
Great. I'm so glad to meet you. And I really appreciate what you've done here.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being on Shannon Confidential.
Great. My pleasure.
Hey, everybody, look down below. See the button? hit subscribe. I love it. Thank you so much for all your support.